Welcome everybody to this webinar. We'll be talking today about the Colorado Model Green Code. I'm Adam Berry. I'm an advisor for building decarbonization here at the Colorado Energy Office. I'm also joined by one of my colleagues from the Office of the State Architect, Bailey Vigil. Bailey, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself really quickly.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adam. Hello, all. My name is Bailey Vigil, and my title is as the Buildings Greenhouse Gas Emissions Analyst in the Office of the State Architect. All those fun words aside, my primary role is to manage the Buy Clean Colorado Act for state public projects. And thanks for having me here today, Adam.
Thanks, Bailey. So we will jump right in. For folks to know, we are planning to have about 45 minutes-ish of presentation here. We plan to try to save around 15 minutes towards the end of the presentation for folks to ask questions. There is a Q&A function that you can feel free to drop your questions in at any time during the meeting or during the webinar, and we can get to those at the end. You will also have an opportunity if you'd like to share your question aloud during that Q&A time at the end of the webinar. You will be able to do that. So we will go ahead and get started here. So I think just general overview of the Model Green Code. What is it? Why do we have it? So House Bill 22-1362, which may be a familiar sounding bill to anyone who's been keeping up to date on the energy code work that we've been doing here at the Energy Office. It's the same piece of legislation that directed the Energy Office to create this code. The code is really just a stretch code that goes above and beyond state energy code requirements and goes beyond just energy to include a few other sustainability-focused measures for buildings and building sites. This is a voluntary code, so I'm going to emphasize that quite a few times during the webinar today. It's underlined, it's bolded, it's italicized for a reason, because we want to be really clear that unlike the state minimum energy codes that have some level of mandatory adoption requirements, this code does not have that, and it is entirely voluntary for local governments who are interested and want to adopt this code to do so. So I mentioned that there are provisions in here for energy, but there are also provisions in here for water efficiency, so reducing the water consumption of our buildings and our building sites, as well as reducing embodied carbon, which if you're not familiar with what embodied carbon is or kind of how it works, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And Bailey will also share some information on the Buy Clean Colorado Act. So just to kind of provide a brief overview of what the code looks like and what its structure is, there's 6 chapters. 2 of those chapters, chapters 3 and 6, do have sub-chapters because, as you'll see a little bit later on in the presentation, there are some differentiated requirements based on kind of a tiered structure of adoption and increasing stringency of requirements. So we'll dive a little bit more into that. But chapter 1 generally is just with all building codes, administrative provisions. Chapter 2 is definitions. All the chapters related to chapter 3 are water use related. Chapters 4 and 5 are energy related, and chapter 6 is focused on embodied carbon. So there's probably some questions as to why we structured the Model Green Code this way, with kind of these sub-chapters that have differing levels, where we have a baseline chapter and we have a stretch chapter and we have kind of just reporting chapters or, simpler, more entry-level chapters. And whereas most building codes are just going to be a long list of requirements you have to meet, and you have to meet all of them unless you're accepted from them, this is structured a little bit differently for a reason. And mainly the reason is to give jurisdictions different entry points into the stretch code. Recognizing that this is a code that goes above and beyond where most jurisdictions are when it comes to energy or sustainability. We wanted to recognize that not all jurisdictions are in the same position to adopt a really stringent stretch code. And so we wanted to provide some easier entry points where a jurisdiction who may not either have the political will or may not have the capacity to enforce or any other reason to still potentially see some provisions in this code that may be attractive to them. Within the water efficiency sections, that kind of looks like a chapter that focuses just exclusively on building fixtures, so things like shower heads, toilets, appliances, all of those different types of things, and reducing water consumption from just the building itself. And then some of these other chapters address, water efficiency and reduction of using potable water at the site level. So things like landscaping. Um, on the energy side, this really does kind of build off and goes beyond the state energy code. So there are a lot of pathways that go above and beyond where the state energy code would take you, but it is designed to layer on top of the state energy code as appropriate. And then within the embodied carbon sections, there's a chapter that just requires reporting, and then there's chapters that require actual embodied carbon reductions and limits on the embodied carbon amounts that a building can have either in the materials or at the building level. So kind of just recognizing that these different chapters and the structure of the code is meant to be a bit more of a menu of options rather than just one code that you have to either choose to adopt or not. So that kind of brings up the question of how would a jurisdiction go about adopting this code. So I just want to really quickly highlight that section 101.5 of the code specifically outlines how chapters 3 through 6, which is water efficiency, energy, and then embodied carbon, all work and kind of what they cover, what each of these subchapters covers, and how a jurisdiction should consider adopting based on what their particular interests are. And so, kind of recognizing that this code is not a code that should just be adopted in its entirety, as most building codes are. If you were to adopt the entire code as it's written, some of these provisions would conflict because some of them are addressing the same requirement, but doing it in a more ambitious way. And so if you were to adopt both requirements, it would be very confusing as to which one you were actually requiring. And so I put down just kind of bullets here to what that looks like. So chapter 3A, as I mentioned, is that one that is just focused on the building water level usage and not the landscaping. So it can be adopted by itself if a jurisdiction wanted to, but chapters 3B and 3C are both focused on kind of that building site landscaping, focused approach. And so 3B and 3C are regulating the same things, but at different levels. And so if you were to adopt 3B and 3C, it would not work very well because there's conflicting measures. So just wanted to acknowledge that, you could adopt 3A and 3B or 3A and 3C, but you couldn't adopt both 3B and 3C. Chapter 6 is similar in that regard, in that there's kind of different combinations in which a jurisdiction could adopt them. So I won't spend too much time talking about that, but just wanted to note that there is a section in the administrative provisions of the code that kind of outlines all of this and gives jurisdictions a guide on what to consider for adoption. And then I did also just want to acknowledge the state level energy and sustainability code landscape. I'm sure there are some folks who are sitting there thinking, oh gosh, another code coming from the state. And so I just really wanted to outline what these different codes are from the energy code side as well as the green code side and make it really clear as to what is required and what's not. So the Colorado Model Electric Ready and Solar Ready code, which hopefully everyone is familiar with at this point, is required as part of the state minimum energy code today. If you're adopting any building code, you should be adopting this code as well, along with the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code. The Colorado Model Low Energy and Carbon Code is kind of the next state minimum energy code. So similar to the electric and solar ready code in that if you're adopting any other building code after that July 1st timeframe, you need to be adopting this code. There's also some questions been floating around about the electric and solar ready code and how that plays into this. So I just wanted to acknowledge again that the electric and solar ready code provisions are included in the low energy and carbon code. And so if you're adopting the low energy and carbon code, the electric and solar ready provisions are already included within it. And then the model green code, as I've already mentioned, and we'll mention again, is voluntary. So there are no requirements for any municipality or county to adopt it. It is another code that's out there in the event that jurisdictions want to go above and beyond the state energy code or want to try to engage in water efficiency or embodied carbon reductions, but is not required. So if you're already overwhelmed with the state energy codes and you say, I can't handle another code, that's fine. You don't have to deal with the model green code unless you want to. So moving on, looking at the model green code provisions, as I mentioned, kind of the three main categories: water efficiency, energy, and embodied carbon. We're going to kind of walk through each of these. I'll walk through the water efficiency and energy provisions first, and then I'm actually going to kind of turn it over to Bailey to briefly provide an overview of the Buy Clean Colorado program, which is Colorado that at the state level, kind of our first foray into the embodied carbon space. And then I will speak to the embodied carbon provisions of the code, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So diving right into water efficiency, as I mentioned, kind of that chapter 3A is the building fixtures, building appliances set of requirements. So this sets water use efficiency requirements for fixtures, fittings, dishwashers, and clothes washers. It specifically limits water use from cooling towers or evaporative cooling systems, minimizing, blowdown and cleaning out of these different systems and how water is utilized in them. To make, and ensuring high levels of efficiency from those systems in their water use, requiring any kitchen equipment to be high efficiency as well from a water use perspective, and then actually requiring water consumption measurement and data collection. So systems that can actually measure the amount of water that is being used by the building as a whole, what those uses are, and collect and report on that data. So that's kind of that more entry level point. For those who are not familiar, the state of Colorado already requires fixtures and fittings and appliances and different things to comply with the EPA's water sense requirements. And so some of these requirements are already aligned with that. Many of them go beyond water sense because we didn't didn't feel it was appropriate to just repeat water sense requirements when those are already in place. But some of these requirements, we did some evaluation and we were able to determine that, we couldn't just justify requiring something more stringent than water sense because there wasn't product availability or the cost implications were too significant. And so some of them align with water sense, but many of them go beyond water sense. Looking at kind of that chapter 3B, so that's more focused on the site and landscaping of buildings, and kind of looking at it from that more baseline level. So this section of the code requires a certain percentage of the landscaped area to be native plants or rainfall adjusted plants. So plants that essentially don't require a lot of irrigation, but are already either native to Colorado or are, designed in a way that can utilize our existing precipitation levels and moisture levels, as opposed to requiring a significant amount of irrigation. It limits landscape irrigation with potable water. So if you are trying to irrigate with potable water, there would be a certain amount of it that you are allowed to use potable water for, but the rest would have to come from what the code defines as alternate sources of water. And then also having irrigation controls for these systems, so to minimize how much water is being used at any given time, and to evaluate whether or not watering of these landscapes are necessary at any given time. It limits how much water you can use on rooftops, vegetated roofs. So to make sure we're not just spraying a bunch of concrete and actually utilizing the water for keeping plants alive. And similar to the first bullet there, trying to encourage native and moisture adjusted plants to be utilized. And then finally, if there are any kind of decorative water features and pools and other things, even like water closets or urinals or anything like that, setting requirements around having to source water from other alternative sources other than potable water to use for those systems. And then kind of looking at that chapter 3C, which is basically just a stretch version of chapter 3B. Essentially, it requires a higher percentage of those plants in the landscape area to be those native plants or those climate adjusted plants than the baseline. So I think the baseline is something like you have to have like 60%, and I think in the stretch you have to have 80% of all plants meeting that requirement. This stretch section prohibits entirely irrigating with potable water. So whereas the baseline just limits how much potable water you can do that you can use for that landscaping, this section prohibits it entirely and requires that all water used for irrigation must be provided by offsite sources of water. And also, I just really want to be clear when we talk about irrigation, we're not talking agricultural irrigation. We're talking about like watering, just like yards and building sites. So we're not talking about food production when we talk about irrigation in this context. Um, and then a lot of the baseline requirements are maintained here as well for the decorative water features, pools, and irrigation controls. And then, kind of one addition that this chapter has is the requirement to utilize water reclamation systems. So, that could be a gray water or other type of water reclamation and treatment system that then recycles the water for other uses in the building. So, this stretch chapter of the water efficiency section requires those systems to be installed and utilized. All right, moving on to energy. So first we'll tackle the residential side of energy, and then we'll tackle the commercial side of energy. So chapter 4, the residential energy provisions chapter, kind of attacks energy in a way that is above and beyond, as I mentioned, the state minimum energy code. So it establishes a few mandatory requirements for residential energy to have in place. So a lot of these, if you are familiar with the low energy and carbon code, some of these are already required in our state minimum energy code, and we just wanted to make sure that they are maintained as well in the green code. So for example, demand responsive controls for water heating and space heating and lighting systems. And then locating ducts in conditioned space. So ductwork generally is not required to be in conditioned space in the energy code. But if you don't include it in, if you don't locate it in conditioned space, then you have to do other insulation and sealing requirements. And so there's a lot of value in having, from an efficiency perspective, those ducts in conditioned space. So this code would require that all those ducts are located in conditioned space. It would require the utilization of energy management technologies, so technology that can essentially monitor energy use and adapt loads as necessary based on either the capacity of the panel or other conditions relating to grid conditions. We actually had an energy management webinar a few weeks ago, so if you haven't had a chance to look at that, I would encourage you to go review that presentation. And then electric, solar, and EV ready code requirements, again, those are part of state minimum code already, and they just are being maintained in this code as well. And then so on top of those mandatory requirements, buildings would be required to essentially comply with one of 3 paths. And the building, if these provisions are adopted as written, the developer would essentially be able to choose whichever of these 3 options that they wanted to comply with. So the 3 options are passive house certification, either through FIAS or PHI. They could build all electric. So basically, they would comply with the energy code as it exists, other than that they would be required to have all electric space heating, water heating, cooking, and clothes drying equipment. And then the third option is net zero energy. So folks may be already familiar with the net zero energy appendix of the IECC. It's based on the ERI path. We don't do a lot to modify that. A lot of that is fairly in line. The one exception there is that we do require for all on-site renewable energy that is installed, that to be accompanied with on-site energy storage as well. So that's kind of the one addition to the IECC net zero energy appendix that is included in this code. And then the other alternative is that, so FIAS has both a passive house core certification as well as a passive house FIAS zero certification. So basically FIAS zero is this net zero energy version of the FIAS core. And so that is allowed as an alternative to the ERI based net zero compliance option. Moving into commercial energy, again, similar to the residential side, there are a number of mandatory requirements. Many of these, 2 out of these 3 are already required by the state minimum energy code again in the demand of responsive controls and the electric, solar, and EV ready requirements. And then the additional mandatory requirement for the commercial energy side is that these buildings must be provided with an energy management and data collection system. So something similar to what I was describing on the water efficiency side, where you have a system that measures the amount of energy being consumed by the building, and at some level being dependent on the different end uses, and measuring how much energy they're consuming, and then is able to provide reports on the data collected by that system. Also similar to the residential side, there are three compliance pathways for the commercial and multifamily buildings. Two of them are similar in that one of them is a passive building certification, again, either through FIAS or PHI, focused specifically on the commercial and multifamily certifications that FIAS and PHI have, and then an all-electric building option as well. And then the one option that kind of differs from the residential side here in the commercial side is an additional efficiency option that is different from the passive house or passive building certification. So folks who are familiar with the low energy and carbon code and its performance pathway, it basically is going to this chapter or this provision is going to align largely with that performance pathway of the low energy and carbon code, but just have more ambitious energy performance targets. So, whereas you might have, been seeing a particular site energy use intensity target that you are going to try to comply with in the low energy and carbon code, this pathway might be very similar in that you do the same types of compliance, but you would have a slightly lower site energy use intensity target to meet in order to comply with the green code pathway. All right, finally, we're going to get into embodied carbon. I'm just going to do a brief, quick overview in case there are folks here who are not familiar with what embodied carbon is. I wrote this definition on the right there, so if don't be mad at me if there's any kind of like slight mischaracterization in the writing of it. But basically, what embodied carbon is carbon associated with extraction, transportation, manufacturing, use, and disposal of materials in not just the building industry, but also just infrastructure projects more broadly. So Bailey might mention a little bit there, in addition to the OSA's compliance under the Buy Clean Colorado Act, there are requirements for the Colorado Department of Transportation as well, specifically because they use similar materials, concrete, steel, other things, where embodied carbon regulation is important. So I will pass it over to Bailey to talk about the Buy Clean Colorado Act.
Sweet. Thanks, Adam. And yeah, feel free to progress whenever you're ready. Sweet. So yes, huge thank you to Adam for including me in this presentation and collaborating with me to ensure that the Model Green Code embodied carbon section and Buy Clean Colorado are in alignment. While the programs are not quite the same, we understand that aligning the requirements where appropriate eases the process for our design teams, our general contractors, and really anyone working on a plethora of projects that may be subject to some sort of embodied carbon requirement. And so yes, the Buy Clean Colorado Act is focused on reducing the carbon impact of eligible materials for state public projects over $500,000. There's also a note in there that these projects must issue a design solicitation on or after January 1st of 2024. So any projects prior to that solicitation date are automatically exempt from the program. And yeah, House Bill 21-1303 is the legislation that prescribed the Office of the State Architect and the Colorado Department of Transportation to set maximum global warming potential or GWP limits for public project materials. And that CRS 2492-117 is the statute that directed Office of the State Architect to set these thresholds. And there is another statute included in this legislation that directs CDOT to set GWP limits for their road, highway, or bridge projects. And so an eligible project for the Buy Clean Colorado Act program means a public project defined as any construction, alteration, repair, demolition, or improvement of any land, building, structure, facility, or other public improvement for which the appropriation or expenditures of money is $500,000. And yes, as you can see from that last line, this is for projects that aren't roads, highways, and bridges. Sweet. Next slide, please. So yes, the ultimate goal of Buy Clean programs is to create a market for low carbon materials and to support clean manufacturing. Through design optimization and the responsible selection of materials, the reduction of embodied carbon emissions from building materials can be accomplished. So to do this, we will require the installation of eligible materials with EPDs or environmental product declarations, basically like food labels, but for different materials. And those EPDs must demonstrate compliant GWP values on all of our state public projects. Next slide. So the eligible materials covered under the Buy Clean Colorado Act include asphalt and asphalt mixtures, cement and concrete mixtures, glass, post-tension steel, reinforcing steel, structural steel, and wood structural elements. You can go to the Office of the State Architect website under Buy Clean Colorado and find our materials that have defined GWP limits associated with them. And so a few things to cover here. First, local municipalities that adopt the embodied carbon section of the Model Green Code do not automatically become subject to the Buy Clean Colorado Act. Once again, Buy Clean only applies to state agencies like the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment or institutions of higher education like CU Boulder. However, since embodied carbon reductions are pertinent to creating low carbon projects, Adam and I work together and set the Model Green Code embodied carbon limits baseline section to directly reference the Buy Clean Colorado Act GWP limits. So you'll see that in that first limit section, the GWP limits referenced there directly aligned with what we're doing at the state level. Yeah, a couple other things. One, Buy Clean programs across the nation are all highly prescriptive. And by that, I mean that these requirements are set on a material by material basis. And so these are great if we're trying to reduce the carbon impact of individual materials. However, for your projects, if you'd like to manage embodied carbon on a more holistic manner, then perhaps taking the whole building life cycle assessment pathway may be better suited for you. So what this could look like is, say you need a higher GWP or higher carbon concrete mix for an outdoor stair design, and say that mix exceeds OSA's GWP limits and then doesn't align with what the Model Green Code has stated. Well, with the whole building approach, you could use this higher GWP concrete mix so long as that you procure a low embodied carbon steel that balances the overall carbon budget for the project. And another thing I really like about Model Green Code is the stretch provisions in general. Not only does the voluntary code align with the efforts that we are doing at the state level, but it also pushes the needle forward by just about 10%. So if you desire going above and beyond and can procure lower carbon materials than what's generally around, then Model Green Code provides that pathway for you. Next slide, please. And since most of the projects that the Model Green Code might apply to are subject to state sales tax, this is an excellent group to inform of the state sales and use tax exemption for purchases of approved eligible decarbonizing building materials. So this program provides a state sales and use tax exemption, which is 2.9% off for eligible decarbonizing material purchases at the point of sale. So this exemption applies to any projects that aren't or that are subject to state sales tax. Our state projects aren't, so they're exempt, but this applies to private work such as personal projects, private corporation projects, as well as local municipality projects. So a couple points here. To receive the exemption, all materials must be approved through the Office of the State Architect and be available on the Department of Revenue's tax exempt list. We have EPD submittal forms available on the Office of the State Architect website, so you can submit compliant EPDs to us for review. We review the EPDs against our GWP thresholds, those limits, and share any new materials with the Department of Revenue on a monthly basis. So we are regularly updating their team to let them know any new findings. You may only submit EPDs to OSA, Office of State Architect, for review if the associated eligible material has an established GWP limit. So if we haven't set any thresholds for a certain subcategory, then it can't make it on the list. So just a couple things to keep there in mind. And finally, this exemption applies at the point of sale, or that's how it was designed to be. However, if the exemption is not applied at the point of sale, you may file with the Department of Revenue for a refund of the tax spent. However, if you must file with Department of Revenue, please note that this process may take quite a while to receive a refund. Therefore, if you can ensure the savings are applied when you purchase the materials, then that'll be the most efficient way to truly realize those savings. Cool. Next slide, please. And yeah, here are some necessary resources if you're interested in receiving the exemption or want to submit EPDs to OSA for review. And just as a final note here, we have seen very limited use of the tax exemption. Therefore, we're developing marketing materials, and that once those are posted, can be shared with suppliers, customers, or at events. And if you encounter any challenges while applying this to projects or managing it for accounting, please reach out. We are actively seeking feedback regarding this exemption and would love to hear any input that you might be willing to share with us. Next, please. And so, yeah, that's all from me. Here's my contact information if you have any questions, want to chat further about embodied carbon or the Buy Clean Colorado Act. Otherwise, yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Bailey. So I think we'll talk a little bit more about also, I think, especially the sales tax exemption and the alignment between the programs on these next couple of slides here. Um, so just diving right in, going back kind of to the structure of the code, this EPD reporting only section specifically is Chapter 6A of the code. And all this chapter does is require developers to report EPDs for the materials that they utilize in a project. It does not set any limits. It does not require any other compliance besides simply just reporting those EPDs. And it does have an exception for any project that, if for whatever reason you're unable to secure an EPD for a particular product and you can demonstrate to the code official that you have not been able to secure that EPD, then it wouldn't require you to comply. But this chapter is really meant to be a more of that entry point reporting requirement where you're not forcing developers to choose alternative products at this time, but you're getting them kind of trained and more knowledgeable about EPDs, about EPD reporting. And, it might also have a potential benefit of helping to inform them more directly of the embodied carbon impacts of their projects so that they could choose to procure lower GWP products even without a requirement in place. So you'll see for this reporting requirement that these categories are pretty much the same as what Bailey just shared for the Buy Clean Colorado Act. As she said, this chapter and the materials-based chapter sections of chapters 6B and 6C are all intended to be aligned with the Buy Clean Colorado Act, both in the materials that are regulated, but also in the limits, except for chapter 6C, which goes, as Bailey mentioned, above and beyond the state limits. So really just focused on reporting here. And there is an exception. Bailey mentioned that there are certain circumstances where this whole building life cycle assessment or analysis, however you want to refer to it, is potentially a viable alternative. So if instead of choosing to select reporting EPDs for every material that within these categories that a builder uses or a developer uses, they could potentially also have a whole building life cycle analysis done instead of reporting these EPDs and submit the life cycle analysis instead. It would achieve a similar outcome in that it would still give the project an idea of what their embodied carbon footprint is for that project, just at more of that project level scale as opposed to on a material by material basis. Moving on to chapter 6B. So this is where the first actual global warming potential limits exist in the code. These are set on building materials and through these alternative compliance options for both new construction and retrofits. So Any materials that would be used in either building a new building or renovating an existing building that are within these material categories would have to comply with these requirements. Um, so there are three compliance options here, and a developer would get to choose between them. So the first of those is basically the Buy Clean Colorado Act program, the same building material limits, same EPD reporting processes, except that it would just be run through the local building department. As you know, the Office of the State Architect is not going to oversee any actual implementation of this code, but just noting that the provisions of the code are aligned with their program. The second of those is whole building lifecycle analysis that I was just talking about. So this would essentially require that a new construction or a renovation would have to demonstrate through this whole building lifecycle analysis that the building you are building or the building you are renovating has a lower embodied carbon footprint than a building with similar or the same characteristics and location and all these other different aspects. And demonstrating essentially that you would be essentially creating a baseline building for yourself and then demonstrating how you would exceed the embodied carbon reductions of that baseline building through the building that you actually design. And then the third option is building material reuse, or also known in some cases as adaptive reuse. This essentially requires reuse of structural and enclosure elements of a building in a construction project. So this would likely occur in the situation where you buy a property that already has a building built on it, and you're either going to essentially, like your plan was to tear that building down and build a new one, or to completely renovate that building. This might be a pathway that is advantageous there, because what this pathway requires is that you retain, structural steel, concrete, other elements of the structure itself that are viable, recognizing that many of which are not viable to retain, but those that are able to be reused if there are significant, structural and enclosure elements in the building that you can reuse, then you could comply via this pathway as well. The purpose being that every material you're able to reuse, that means you don't have to procure a new material that was manufactured and transported, and all the carbon emissions associated with the production of the new material are all offset by the reuse of the existing material that was already in place. Finally, we have Chapter 6C, which essentially is just a dialed up version of Chapter 6B. So it sets more ambitious limits on those materials and on the compliance options for the life cycle analysis and reuse. So for the materials approach itself, again, the structure of the section relies on the Buy Clean Colorado Act structure and those same materials, but essentially it increases, or rather decreases, the embodied carbon that is allowed to be representative as part of that material by 10%. So if you had a building material that had a 100 kilogram of CO2e per cubic meter or whatever, I'm just making up numbers at this point, of carbon emissions associated with that material, this section would require you to meet it at a 90 instead of a 100. So basically just lower GWP targets. The second, the life cycle analysis pathway, whereas the baseline building, or the baseline code in Chapter 6B requires a total embodied carbon reduction of the project of a 10% relative to that kind of standard baseline building. This section would require a 20% reduction of embodied carbon relative to that baseline building. And then finally, within that building materials reuse section, whereas the baseline section in Chapter 6B requires 45% of those building structural and enclosure elements to be reused, this stretch section would require 75% of building structural and enclosure elements to be reused. All right, I just wanted to highlight, some of you may have seen this slide before in previous presentations. I just wanted to acknowledge that the Energy Office does provide a significant amount of training and technical assistance and other resources on our state codes. We do plan to provide additional training and technical assistance offerings on the Model Green Code as well. We have not come out with any of those yet, and we have not hosted any trainings on the Green Code as of yet. But we are working with our vendor at Noresco and some of our other stakeholders to really build up our capacity to provide training to both local jurisdictions and industry professionals on the Model Green Code, on water efficiency, on embodied carbon, on some of these all electric energy and other aspects. So we are working to build up our capacity to do that. And I just wanted to acknowledge that those will be coming in the coming months. So that is all that we have for this presentation, and we were right about on time. So we have about 15 to 20 minutes left here for any questions. We'll start to go down the questions that have been submitted in the Q&A thus far and address those one at a time. If you would like to share your question verbally, just feel free to raise your hand. You should be able to raise your hand, and then my colleague Andrew can promote you to be a panelist. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. We're going to get to those questions in the Q&A first, and then we will get to you all. All right, Q&A from Kim Schlepfer. How do these standards align with like fixtures, fittings, and equipment efficiency and others with other standards like LEED certification minimums? Kim, so I think that there were goals to try to align where possible. So I think we identified, for example, within the embodied carbon provisions that some of the adaptive reuse requirements align with the LEED thresholds for those provisions. And I think a lot of the water efficiency provisions aligned as well. They're not all 100% aligned because some of these we adapted based on market availability and market readiness in Colorado specifically as we were evaluating it in the development of this code. So there may be some misalignments between standards like LEED, but a lot of them are aligned. All right, we got another question. If a jurisdiction adopts the efficiency standards, how are consumers going to know what fixtures qualify and what direction should be given to retailers about supplying non-compliant products? So that's a really good question. I think it's somewhat similar to how we do that with appliances today. So, for example, the Energy Code has specific efficiency standards for appliances, and when a building department is doing plan review and then later doing inspections, they will be evaluating the efficiency of the fixtures and the efficiency of the appliances that are being installed to make sure that they comply with the code. So that's kind of what's happening on the enforcement side in terms of how we're educating consumers on what's allowed. I think that there it would need to be some active engagement with contractors and with builders and retailers and other folks to try to make sure that they are familiar with what is required, because this is with the building code type of structure, this is an installation, design and installation requirement. It's not necessarily a point of sale requirement, kind of like appliance standards. And so inherently, retailers won't be limited in what they can sell, but it's more incumbent upon the contractor and the builder and the building department to make sure that the correct equipment and fixtures are being installed that comply with the code. All right. Got another question. Other than the Energy Office, who is a great resource for the EV requirements in building codes? So there are recharge coaches. I think that's probably what you're referring to here in this question around EV programs and code requirements generally. So those are available. You can find more information about those on the Energy Office website. We have been working to educate the recharge coaches on the Energy Code and on the EV ready code requirements in the code. And so they should be knowledgeable and be able to help answer any questions. And I know you're looking for resources other than the Energy Office, but just noting that our staff is always happy to help answer any questions that you might have. All right, going back to another question from Kim. Let's say a community is interested in water efficiency and embodied carbon, but none of the other elements of the Green Code. Can a community pick and choose provisions out of the Green Code, or would they need to adopt the full code? So generally speaking, the structure of the code was designed to be more of that pick and choose type of structure, that menu of options. I think jurisdictions could do this in a couple of ways. I think You could either, in an adopting ordinance, specify which provisions of the code are being adopted and which are not. The other side of that is you could pull provisions out of this code and insert them into another code if you wanted to. So, for example, energy related provisions, if you were really interested in the energy provisions, you could take those out, the language out of the green code and incorporate them as an amendment to your energy code rather than having a separate code. And that would be a perfectly viable way to adopt them. So I think there's multiple different approaches that jurisdictions could take to adopt this piecemeal. But we ultimately did design it in a way to try to make it more functional to adopt in a piecemeal way. All right, I see we keep having Q&A questions come in, and I don't want to abandon our live questioners. So, Andrew, if you wouldn't mind promoting Tracy, we can give her an opportunity to ask her question. And
Yeah, I'm unfortunately having some technical difficulties
oh, okay,
trying to promote them, so I don't know if you can give it
I
a
can do it. Yep,
try.
yep,
Yeah,
I can do
thank
it.
you.
All right, Tracy, you should be able to unmute and
Yeah.
speak.
Okay. Hi. Yeah. Thank you so much for this great green code. You know, I was prime sponsor of this and really insisted on a green code. I had a couple questions. How much interest is there in Colorado in the green code? And also, how unique is this green code across the US?
It's a good question. So I think the first part of your question, what interest has there been? I think we've heard from a number of jurisdictions who are interested in elements of it. I think, kind of to Kim's question from before, I don't know that we've been necessarily hearing from jurisdictions that they would like to adopt the green code wholesale. Um, but there have been those who have expressed interest in embodied carbon or water efficiency improvements, or energy requirements that go above and beyond the state energy code. So I would say maybe, I don't know that I have a specific number for you, probably in the low double digits of folks we've engaged with directly and had any conversations with. But we are certainly going to try to drum up additional interest and um, desire to adopt provisions of this code over the next few years. And then the second question, I think, was related to how unique this code is around the country. I think water efficiency and embodied carbon provisions as part of code are not very common as far as we have seen. So there are also water efficiency provisions in the International Green Construction Code, in some of these other standards, like Kim was talking about, LEED and others. Um, I think we have seen relatively minimal adoption of these types of requirements in other jurisdictions. So I think, for example, with the IGCC, I think that the latest number I saw is that only somewhere between 20 and 30 counties and municipalities and states around the country have adopted that. And so I don't know if there are individual like water efficiency requirements that jurisdictions have chosen to adopt that we're not familiar with. But I would say that this is fairly revolutionary. And then in terms of within the United States, embodied carbon, I believe the only other jurisdiction that has any kind of requirements in their code is California. Cal Green has requirements for, I believe, commercial buildings over 100,000 square feet to comply with embodied carbon requirements. But there are a few other jurisdictions around the world that have. Vancouver, British Columbia, and Canada is one of them, that we have communicated with and engaged with on developing our code requirements. So again, I would say on the embodied carbon side, it's also fairly early and advanced.
I just want to hop in and agree to that statement that, especially for local municipalities, more on that residential side, embodied carbon is fairly new. We are seeing it more across the country at the state level. So to be able to communicate the goals of Buy Clean and bring embodied carbon to these more local levels is pretty novel. Great question.
Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. All right. We will go to Mark next. You have your hand up. Mark, you should be able to unmute and ask your question. Mark, if you're speaking, you are on mute. All right. Well, we're not hearing you, Mark. So we'll give you a minute to try to figure that out, and we'll come back to you. So coming back to the Q&A here, we got a question from Michael. Whole building life cycle assessments offer a substantially more comprehensive understanding of a building's performance, and conducting several assessments early in design can help clarify which material choices meaningfully influence both embodied and operational carbon. Are there any incentives available to encourage designers to adopt whole building life cycle analyses? As of now, there are not, Michael. I mean, anybody utilizing low embodied carbon materials through, as a result of a LCA would be able to take advantage of that state sales tax exemption as well, as long as it's a compliant material. But there is no specific incentive at this time for encouraging LCAs, although it would be something that we could definitely explore in the future. All right, next question. Will projects with state grant funding through DOLA need to meet the BCCO if they have only accepted the carbon code but not the model green code? That's a Bailey question.
Thank you for that. Projects that receive DOLA funding are not subject to Buy Clean Colorado. There are other programs that may come into play, such as the High Performance Certification Program. But Buy Clean Colorado currently only impacts state public projects like for CDPHE or universities. Thank you.
Thanks, Bailey. All right. Next question. What system does Colorado use to track compliance for voluntary measures? It's a good question. So the state, in terms of tracking actual compliance with the code, would not really be involved in that. In Colorado, codes are enforced locally. And with this code, it would be no different. So local building departments would evaluate code compliance both through plan review and inspections. And the state would not necessarily have a direct active role in doing that. I'm not sure if that answers the question. If not, feel free to submit a follow-up question and we can get to that. Next question: for the water and energy data and management collection, who is the data being reported to and how? Ideally, the data, so this is required for commercial buildings, and the data would be ultimately, the goals of the data would be reported to the building operators and managers, and potentially the building owner. Part of the reason for requiring that is to evaluate where your biggest water end uses are. I would imagine that there are a lot of building operators and owners out there who aren't necessarily super familiar with their largest end uses for water. And so this would give them insight into that and help them potentially improve efficiency or modify their activities accordingly to try to reduce water consumption. The other thing that this monitoring helps to do is provide detection for malfunctions or leaks or other types of situations where a system might not be operating in the way that it's supposed to, and this measurement and collection system can essentially identify spikes in water usage or significant reductions in water usage that could indicate to a maintenance team that there is a problem that they need to address. So there are, I think, a number of different uses in which that data can benefit, but ultimately the goal is for, like, the jurisdiction would not be collecting that data, at least within the construct of the code. I mean, a jurisdiction could always, I guess, require that building owners turn that data over, but that would be up to them to figure out that requirement. Astrid, how does this code align with the Colorado Wildfire Resiliency Code? It's a good question. In terms, I'm assuming the question maybe is largely around material selection. So the Wildfire Resiliency Code obviously is looking at the fire resilience and fire capabilities associated with these building materials. And so there is some potential, I think, for some overlap or conflict potentially with an individual building material. Although I would say that largely speaking, and Bailey, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, the majority of the materials themselves that are on the Buy Clean Colorado list are structural, not necessarily exterior, which is a lot of what the Wildfire Resiliency Code is going to govern, is like exterior facing and materials. It's not that it doesn't address structural at all, but I think that because of that, there is not as much inherent potential for conflicts between the two codes. But if there's anything you're particularly concerned about, I would say feel free to flag that for us, and we could potentially engage with the Division of Fire Prevention and Control to see what their thoughts would be about anything you might be concerned with. All right, next question. Will the county and or city have to adopt the codes to come into effect, or will it be in effect automatically across Colorado? So Colorado, with a couple of exceptions, is a home rule state. So local governments would be required to adopt this and enforce it themselves in order for these requirements to be in effect. These will, Buy Clean Colorado obviously is in effect statewide for public projects, but for them to apply to private projects across the state, a jurisdiction would have to adopt them. Tracy had a follow-up question. Will there be a copy of the presentation on our website? Yes, we do plan to post both this webinar, a link to the recording of the webinar, as well as the slides on the website. Next question from John. Are there large Colorado cities that are ready or expected to adopt the commercial energy code? I think it's possible, certainly. I think there have been a handful of jurisdictions we've talked to that might be interested in these. I don't believe that there are any that we have any firm commitments from to advance those commercial energy code requirements at this time. But also keeping in mind that the Model Green Code has been out now for 2 weeks. So it's very possible that that interest will continue to grow over time. But I can't speak to specific jurisdictions who are planning to adopt this at this point. All right, next question. Can you touch on the differences between the state minimum requirements versus the Model Green Code? Oof, I don't know that we have enough time to get into all the differences between the state minimum energy code and the Model Green Code. I would say my email's on the screen. I'm happy to follow up with you more in depth because there are a lot. So I'm happy to follow up on that later. According to the slide, the building materials approach mandates a 10% reduction from baseline, while the whole building LCA requires a 20%. So I think that this is, sorry, there's I think a bit of a miscommunication on that from that slide. So the stretch chapter is essentially trying to achieve 10% across improvement across both the materials and whole building LCA pathway. So under the baseline chapter, the materials based pathway complies with the Buy Clean Colorado limits, and the LCA pathway complies with a 10% reduction below a standard reference building. And so the stretch chapter reduces the Buy Clean Colorado limits by 10%, so a 10% overall improvement from the materials pathway. And then the whole building life cycle analysis pathway goes from 10% reduction to 20. So it's still a 10% reduction on that LCA pathway, not 20. It's 20% reduction relative to the reference building, but only 10% improvement relative to the baseline chapter of the code, if that makes sense. Next question, are there examples of local governments that have adopted a Model Green Code where building permits outpaced the growth of municipalities without it? I have not seen any. I think the other thing, as we were describing earlier, there are so few green codes adopted around the country that I don't know that there's been enough data to look at that situation. So I don't think, nothing that I have seen indicates that that's the case, but I think there's so little data on that particular question that I don't know that I have a good answer for you. And then Tracy, another question, what are examples of enclosure elements as opposed to structural elements in the recycling section? So I think you can think of structural elements as like beams, girders, like all rebar, like all these different elements that are like holding up the building. And whereas the enclosure is like the wall assemblies and roof assemblies and windows and all of these different elements that enclose the structure. So yeah, I think structural keeps the building up. Enclosure kind of is everything that encloses the building from a building envelope perspective. All right. Well, I'm going to give Mark one more chance. Mark, can you hear us? Are you able to unmute and ask your question? All Right. Well, we're not hearing you, Mark. So I would just encourage you, if you do have a question, feel free to follow up with me via email. Happy to respond. Otherwise, that is all the Q&A that we've got. So thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate your interest in the Model Green Code. Both my contact information and Bailey's is there on the screen. If you have any questions about the Green Code, feel free to reach out to me. Any questions about Bike Clean Colorado, feel free to reach out to Bailey. All right. Well, thanks so much, everybody, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Adam.